Okay, well, why don't we get started? Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Courtney Doggart, and I'm the president of Network 2020. It is a pleasure to have here today Elmira Bayrasli and Buke Cuhadar from two different places, but who will be in conversation about the impact of COVID-19 on entrepreneurship around the world. So what I'll do is I'll just give you a little bit of their background so you know with whom you are getting to hear from, and then I'll turn it over to them for a dialogue. So Elmira Bayrasli is the director of Bard College's Globalization and International Affairs program. She co-founded Foreign Policy Interrupted, which is terrific, and you should all check it out if you haven't heard of it. And she is the host of Project Syndicate's podcast, Opinion Has It. She is the author of From the Other Side of the World, Extraordinary Entrepreneurs, Unlikely Places, a book that looks at the rise of entrepreneurship globally. Elmira has lived in Sarajevo, where she was the chief spokesperson for the OSCE Mission. From 1994 to 2000, she was presidential appointee at the US State Department, working for Madeleine Albright and Richard Holbrooke, respectively. She is a regular contributor on global entrepreneurship for Techcrunch. She also provides analysis on foreign policy, particularly on Turkey. Her work has appeared in Reuters, Foreign Affairs, Washington Post, Quartz, Fortune, Forbes, CNN, NPR, BBC, Al Jazeera, The Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. She sits on several boards, including Invest to Innovate, Turkish Women's International Network, and Our Secure Future. And Buke Cuhadar serves as vice president of the Global Entrepreneurship Network, a year-round platform of programs and initiatives created by the communities that celebrate Global Entrepreneurship Week each November. Aimed at creating one global entrepreneurial ecosystem, GEN, the Global Entrepreneurship Network, helps people in over 170 countries unleash their ideas and turn them into promising new ventures. Buke has primary responsibility for coordinating the leaders of national networks in each of those countries while strengthening the collection of organizations that support them. Prior to joining the Global Entrepreneurship Network, Buke was the Marcom and Outreach Director at Endeavor Turkey, an affiliate of a global organization to catalyze long-term economic growth by selecting, mentoring, and accelerating the best high-impact entrepreneurs around the world. While at Endeavor Turkey, Buke led the Global Entrepreneurship Week Turkey campaign, building a successful initiative and a board engaging more than 200 players across the entrepreneurship spectrum in Turkey. So we have excellent expertise with us. We also, just as a warning, do have we experienced some mild technical difficulties beforehand. So if at any point one of our speakers drops off, we apologize in advance, but everyone keep your fingers crossed that the connection will hold and we'll have a good dialogue. So with that, I'll turn it over to Elmira and Buke for a conversation, and then we'll open it up to questions in a little bit.
Oh, okay, great. Can you hear me now? Okay, great. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Courtney, and welcome to everyone here. I always love collaborating with Network 2020 and Courtney and her team, who are absolutely terrific. It's a really wonderful group of people to engage in a discussion on the things that are going on around in the world today. And I'm super excited to be joined by my friend and my colleague, Buke, who I've known for a very long time. We've worked together on global entrepreneurship for pretty much the past decade. And when Courtney actually asked me if I would do a discussion on global entrepreneurship, which I think is on a lot of people's mind, particularly the economy and business, and how are we all going to get through this current crisis that we're in, she was one of the first people that popped into my head. She works at the Global Entrepreneurship Network and is very involved with building global entrepreneurial ecosystems around the world. And so with that, I wanted to actually kick off the discussion and ask you, Buke, can you kind of give us a scene setter about how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected entrepreneurial ecosystems around the world? You have to unmute.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Elmira. It's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you, everybody, for joining this session. I know you all must be very busy at this time, trying to deal with this uncertain world. And it's no different for anybody right now. We're all kind of facing the consequences of the same situation. And I think when we look at around the world, some countries are more used to this. Some countries have more experience with dealing with crises like this. And to some, it's just like the US in a way. This is kind of new, especially having something at this rate and so suddenly. I think devastated all of us. I'm going to quote from Reid Hoffman. He says entrepreneurship is like jumping off a cliff while trying to build an airplane. And I think right now we're all entrepreneurs. We're all trying to do that same thing. And as ecosystem builders, I feel like everybody I work with, they're both trying to save their organizations. They're looking into the sustainability of how they can be more valid during today's circumstances. And at the same time, they're trying to support entrepreneurs. They're trying to play that bridge role between the government, the entrepreneurs, some of the resources that are available, some of the resources that are not so obviously available, some of the misinformation that is going around the world around this pandemic, and trying to find a way to come out of this with as little damage as possible. And I want to turn this over to Elmira at this point, because she has a good perspective on how entrepreneurs actually themselves react to this situation. And I think from there, we can perhaps get back to how the ecosystem builders are supporting entrepreneurs with some of these efforts.
Sure. So it's been interesting to watch how businesses and startups have been reacting to the current situation. Obviously, most of the world is under a shelter-in-place order. Businesses are shut down. You know, we can't go out into the coffee shop, where I think a lot of entrepreneurs usually try to work and try to build their businesses and their ideas. And we can't meet. And that's kind of the most critical thing for entrepreneurs to do. The myth that the entrepreneur, you know, works in a garage by him or herself and then invents these great inventions is just patently false. Entrepreneurs really thrive in environments where they can have exchange and they can come together and they can collaborate on things. And when you take a look at the history of all the great entrepreneurs, you can really see that come to life, where they have been able to build their businesses out of really best practices and collaboration with one another. And I think the biggest thing I think there's a couple of categories. I think that there is those businesses that have not really been affected and have actually thrived as a result of the current situation. And when we take a look at what those are, obviously education platforms, because now schools are closed, and so people are going to and trying to find ways to keep learning going. So Khan Academy, Udemy, and a lot of different other education platforms are really doing well. Obviously, platforms like Zoom, the technology that enables us to be in our apartments, but be connected, where we can actually see one another and carry on conversations like this. Obviously, companies like that are doing well. And obviously, we've heard about how Zoom has gone up well. Companies like Netflix and Hulu, entertainment companies, because again, movie theaters closed, can't go to the theater, can't go to the restaurant. What are we going to do for entertainment? So those companies are really doing well. And then the final category, obviously, is health companies that are focused in on medicine and in technology. Those companies are really doing well, understandably so. And I want to get back to that point, because that has not always been the case. And it makes me angry that we have not invested more in research and development into medicine and healthcare companies. But another company that's doing really well is Facebook. obviously, again, platforms that are bringing us socially. But there are a lot of companies that are not doing well. And normally companies like I mentioned, coffee shops, restaurants, movie theaters, those normally would be recession proof. Even when we had the 2008 global financial crisis, you really didn't see a lot of those businesses be affected too much. And that's not to say that none were affected. Of course, there are always going to be some, but you really
more resilient.
They're much more resilient, because the reality is we want to go get coffee in the morning, and we want to go to the movies, and we want to be social. But those businesses have been really profoundly affected. And I think that it's going to be interesting to see how a lot of companies in that category are able to pivot. So ways that they have been pivoting are obviously doing takeout and delivery. I rented a movie from my local movie theater that I was able to stream into my apartment. But companies that are really doing badly, that we all know about, that have done a lot of huge business, have been Uber, Lyft, Airbnb. And those are companies that I'd love to have at some point in this discussion, a conversation about how they were considered unicorns, where venture capital was pouring huge amounts of money into it, and now they're actually really suffering. So I'm going to leave it there, and because I can go on and talk endlessly about these individual entrepreneurs, but the point of this is actually to engage in a wider conversation. And so, Buke, I would love to go back to you about, in terms of the global entrepreneurs that the ecosystem actors that you work with, what have been the biggest challenges, or some of the things that you've seen them kind of raise up and say, hey, like, if there are challenges, I can help address that?
So I think one of the biggest challenges they have is the misinformation, and also lack of information around what are the resources available for entrepreneurs, what type of, for example, government grants these are involved as part of these relief packages, and what parts of it do work and don't work for entrepreneurs. And having that conversation with both sides of the equation, I think, has been a big challenge for everyone. I think a lot of our stakeholders are trying to convert their operations and their programs into digital. And of course, it's a challenge trying to do all of this at once, and being able to reach to the same audiences, and also acquiring, I guess, along the way, new audiences. But I feel like the countries where the connectivity is much better have been more successful with this. But when you look at countries around Africa, where the internet connection is not so great and not so stable, they have to kind of reinvent creative ways of dealing with this. So, for example, one of our Global Entrepreneurship Week hosts from Somalia decided that they would open up call centers to deal with these kinds of requests. So they opened up call centers in 3 districts where entrepreneurs can actually get connected, hear the latest news, get mentorship, get support on what around their needs. So it does require a lot of listening to what are the stakeholders in need of now, and it requires really changing ways around that. For example, our Gen affiliate in New Zealand very early on created a Zoom group, a Slack group, a Slack workspace around this. It started with a couple of groups around the crisis response, like you mentioned, in terms of groups around edtech entrepreneurs, how they can potentially help during this. also allocating, those who have services to offer and those who are in need of services. And they created conversation around these topics to see, how they can be part of the solution. And I think for most of our people, it's very important to act locally, but they're all very aware that this is a global world. It's a global ecosystem. And as part of this global world, whatever you do, everybody else is working on the same thing. Whatever you do, some other country is probably suffering more, but it may come back to you. So building that awareness around what's happening around the world, getting that correct information, getting those, being able to implement some of the innovations that others are doing has been one of their priorities as well. I actually, around this, I have a question for you, because we know that some of the biggest startups were actually created during the crisis times, because entrepreneurs actually always look at things from the positive side. And this is one of the things we as ecosystems very much enjoy, because we see their positivity, we see how they pivot, we see how they change things so quickly to adapt to the new world. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think about this thesis? Are there going to be a lot of new startups coming with this crisis?
Yeah, it's interesting, because when I was working with entrepreneurs around the world and doing the research for my book, the one thing that I found is that entrepreneurs are really much different than, I think, a lot of other people, in that they really are very focused individuals. They're very persistent and they're resilient. And so even though there might be so many obstacles in front of them, if they have an idea, they really go out there, and regardless of those obstacles, go out there to execute on those ideas. And as you pointed out, some of the best startups have started in economic downturns. So when you take a look at FedEx, which was started in 1971, right around the time that we had the the oil embargo here in the United States. And then in 1975, when we were having an economic crisis, Bill Gates started Microsoft. General Motors started at the turn of the 20th century in 1907. And it's still around today. And so you really see how there are opportunities, and there are. And the reason that I think entrepreneurs find times of crisis as a good opportunity to start businesses is for a number of reasons. Obviously, we're hearing a lot about unemployment and how unemployment numbers are just really going through the roof. Here in the United States, we've had more than 5 million people apply for unemployment insurance. That's a lot. And when you find yourself without a job, as I think, Buke, we've talked about this, around the world, people start their own businesses primarily because there are no opportunities. And so they have to create their own jobs. And I think this is another situation where people feel like, well, I may have gotten laid off, or the future is uncertain, so this is a good opportunity for me to start a business. And I definitely think that that's true now. The other things that go in favor for people starting businesses now is that because there's so many people unemployed, you have a larger talent pool to draw from. So you can go out there and you can actually find really talented people to help you with whatever endeavor that you want to go ahead and that you want to go and set up. Obviously, we're hearing a lot about relief packages, loans to small businesses. And so government, again, the opportunities that governments are extending to entrepreneurs is plentiful. But then there's also the flip side of the coin, where there is a challenge of businesses being started today. How are they going to scale up? How are they going to get customers? How are they going to go out there and market themselves? And as I pointed out before, I think there are a certain number of industries that are actually going to be favored as a result of this crisis. Definitely technology, definitely education, definitely entertainment, and most definitely things in the healthcare and the medical arena. I think companies that you've seen focus in on the gig economy, where people kind of piecemeal their jobs together, whether you're an Uber driver or whether you're renting out your apartment on Airbnb or whether you're working on TaskRabbit, I think those companies, those type of companies, you're going to really see a decline in, and you're going to see investors not wanting to go ahead and back companies like that. Did Buke, is Buke, is she frozen? I think
she may be. Yeah. Ah. All right. Well, hopefully she'll come back. But in the meantime, Elmira, do you want to expand on any of what you were saying, or maybe talk a little bit about how entrepreneurs might be able to weather this storm?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a lot of things. I think for entrepreneurs, I think there's a couple of things that they really need to keep in mind. One is the famous thing that I hear always in Silicon Valley is how government should get out of the way. Well, I have news for Silicon Valley. In this situation, the government is really your ally and your friend. As we've all seen, for better or worse, we're really nothing without government intervention. I think the government has been the one body that we have turned to actually help us weather through this crisis. And so I think for entrepreneurs, that what they really need to do is they really need to be paying attention to what governments are doing. And as Buke pointed out, that's both at a local level and both at an executive federal level. Like, what is your central government doing? What is your local government doing? There are different resources. And resources in terms of, are there tax incentives? Are there loans that are being given out? You really need to be paying attention to that. You also need to be paying, if you're an entrepreneur, you need to be paying attention to legislation. And this is very key. And I think it's going to be something that's going to be increasingly discussed in both Silicon Valley and in Washington, D.C., but I think a lot of global capitals. Certainly, we've seen a lot of tech companies kind of flout any type of privacy regulations and really become an ever so dominant presence in our life. And before the crisis, we've heard about proposals to break up companies like Facebook because they've gotten too big. Certainly, this is something that scares Silicon Valley, but this is actually, I think, going to be something that entrepreneurs, particularly in the tech space, are going to have to really pay attention to. I think there's going to be a lot more government intervention and legislation about how companies go about their business. This is one point where I think the EU and Europe has done a far better job than the United States, where they've really gotten onto individuals' privacy rights and how individuals' information is being used by technology companies. And it'll be interesting to see how this debate moves forward. I think it's too early to tell. In terms of other resources, I think the one thing that entrepreneurs really need to remind themselves is why did you get into doing what you're doing in the first place? I know that I started my own organization, and while I don't create widgets or a product, I do offer services. And it's often really hard for entrepreneurs to kind of remember what it is that they're going out there and doing because they're so focused on the marketing. Well, you have to remember right now, customers are in a different situation, right? A lot of people have lost their jobs. Unemployment is high, so people might not be able to spend on things, on particular services. So you really need to kind of, entrepreneurs really, what they need to do is put themselves in the shoes of the customer rather than kind of thinking like, how can I go out there and market, and how can I get out there and sell my product. And this is where I actually do think, and going back to the global, where global entrepreneurs have an advantage over entrepreneurs in the United States. And when I went around the world doing my book, I went to basically every continent with the exception of Antarctica and Australia. Apologies, Australia. And what I really found is, when the global financial crisis happened in 2008, the entrepreneurs in places like South Africa, in Mexico, in Turkey, weathered it far better than entrepreneurs in the United States. And if you ask why, those countries have dealt with crises so much more than we have in the United States or in the West in general. And so their ability for resilience is so much higher, and their willingness to go out there and overcome those obstacles, it's been set for them, right? Because the obstacles are so great in these countries that they've had no other choice to do that. And so, Buke, I'm glad that you're back with us, and I wanted to ask you, are there a couple? Well, you talked about an entrepreneur in Somalia, this ecosystem in Somalia, but can you talk about a couple of success stories in terms of the Global Entrepreneurship Network, where they can offer lessons to those of us in the United States or in the West in general?
Yes, for sure. And my apologies, my connection has been very unstable. I had to switch to my iPad, and hopefully it's working out and you can hear me.
Yes.
Zoom application kept shutting down. So one example, so I'd like to mention here a resource that we're creating as Gen Global. So we looked at, as you know, everybody, all of the entrepreneurship support organizations are trying to see if they can collect some of the resources, some of the innovations, some of the existing startups or new startups that are working, that are coming out of this. And what we did as Gen Global is we reached out to our network, because we're in 160 countries and we haven't really seen innovations from around the world around this. We've seen maybe Europe, like Elmira was saying. We've seen maybe some of the Western economies, what they're doing, because they're usually much better at reporting these developments. But we haven't seen how all these countries around the world are responding to this, and what are some of the innovations coming out. For this purpose, we created a resource document, and I will share the link to it in the dialogue, or perhaps we can share it with you after this seminar. One that I really like is actually from Georgia. So one of the Global Entrepreneurship Network's startups, they were a wine company, and in order to promote their wines, they were doing all these testings with their audiences, doing bringing the actual person who invented the wine, and talking about their stories. And during this crisis, they figured out a way to deliver this wine to the audiences in advance, and do the wine tasting actually online with a similar group of people, and with the founder of the wine attending. So I thought this was one of the really very trivial but really impressive example of how startups react to these situations. Let me think. I think again, another impressive example from our network was from Australia. One of the startups figured out a way of gathering all of the food distribution networks around Australia. So those were in immediate need of accessing food, and volunteers who are willing to help with this, and of course whatever resources from all kinds of stakeholders, including the government, are available. So anybody can actually go there, either ask for support or find ways of meeting their needs through this platform. So I think I've seen tons of examples, like how entrepreneurs are recreating, reinventing their platforms to help with the current situation. And I think we also see a lot of them trying to refigure their product market fit, because, you know, that's really is not the same as, you know, what they started with. And they don't know, they have to find feasible methods of testing, you know, their new strategy. And, you know, that's not going to happen overnight. They have to test it along the way. And if they see certain, if they see that it's working, then they will need to convince their investors, their board, that this is going to work, and they're going to be able to continue. I think, you know, the path is not easy, and you know, we're all playing here the role of, you know, what will happen next. We're trying to guess, or we're trying to, you know, predict what's going to happen. But it's even tougher for entrepreneurs, because they have to predict, and they have to be quite close to, you know, getting it correctly. Otherwise, they won't survive. Also, they're really working on getting their teams motivated during a time like this, because, you know, they're trying to figure out how much cash, how long their cash will last them, and how they're gonna be able to keep their workforce, or, you know, find ways of bringing them back if they furlough them. So it is a really tough situation. But I do feel that a lot of entrepreneurs know this game very well. They have done it before. Many of them have failed many times, so they will keep trying.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I think this kind of could bring us to, you know, how we predict the future of this. You know, how do we see the global ecosystem, or the global world evolve after this? What will the new normal look like? Elmira, I'm sure you have some insights on, you know, what it could be.
I think that, I mean, it's going to be interesting how businesses start opening up. And I know that there are a lot of discussions out there about how do businesses, you know, go back and open up, and in a way that is safe and that is going to be productive for everyone. And certainly, I think one thing is for sure is that, you know, I talked about legislation. Certainly in the United States, I think there's going to be a really hard discussion about healthcare, and, you know, making sure that, you know, workers and employees have access to paid leave and access to healthcare, so that they can go get treated if they're not feeling well. Obviously, this is not an issue in most countries out of the United States, which I'm very jealous of, but I won't get into my lefty politics. But in terms of how I think a couple of the things that I think will happen is, one, I think you're going to start to see venture capital become much more careful, the investors, whether it's private equity or venture capital, in what they're going in and investing in. And so the big investments that I talked about earlier with Uber and Lyft and Airbnb, you know, you have the young 20-something tech bros who are very charismatic and are able to go into these all, you know, predominantly white male networks and raise huge amounts of money and have these huge valuations. I'm not too sure we're going to see that anymore. I think investors are going to start to be much more careful about who they're putting their money into, and the whole, you know, the charisma and the old boys network. I don't necessarily think that is going to work. I think healthcare companies and investments in research and development, which is different from actual, you know, companies that are starting to work in healthcare. I think what we're going to start to see is more investments in universities and R&D labs, and doing those things as we rightly should. Because if we actually go back and look at the history of Silicon Valley and the birth of entrepreneurship, that was very much started by the Department of Defense and by the US government, who invested huge amounts of money in research and development on radio transistors, on the development of the microchip and really put a lot of its own money into, you know, space exploration and science and technology. And so if the United States does have a robust tech scene now, it was very much because of Washington, D.C. and the U.S. government really getting behind it. And so I think we're going to start to see a reinvestment in that. You're already starting to see the EU has a fund where it's the European Union that is investing in that innovation, in that research and development, but in those firms. And a lot of other countries are doing it already. Turkey is one country that is doing it. Lebanon is doing it. Mexico is doing it. I think we're going to start to see a lot more on a government level, countries really getting involved on the global entrepreneurship scene. But I'm going to stop there because I can go on and on because I think Courtney wants to move over to, do you want to move over to the Q&A, Courtney?
Yeah, I think it's a good time to do that because it looks like we're about 12:40. Yeah. So why don't we move over to Q&A? We do have someone with their hand raised. So if Brian, if you wouldn't mind unmuting Lena, we can have her ask her question and then we'll turn over to the Q&A box.
Hi, everybody, and a special hi to Elmira. So I'm sitting in my son's room in Malmö in Sweden. And I know there has been a debate, I've followed it from the Swedish side in the US about Sweden being the odd person out in this global pandemic. But I wanted to talk about something else. What we have seen in Sweden is a trend and a hashtag that is really trending is buy locally, support your local business. I know this is about global entrepreneurs, but I wanted to raise this. So for instance, people say, I'm not gonna, because you know, here everything is more or less open. We haven't shut down. So we can make the choice, where do we want to put our money? And what is now trending is to put your money locally. We boycott Starbucks. We don't want to put our money in Starbucks. We go to the local Katarina cafe, you know. We go to the local bakery. We all even choose where we buy our food. And I wanted to see if you have any thoughts about this. So this is one trend that I'm seeing. The other trend, which is related to healthcare, is that we have had quite disturbing raise of deaths among the older population, let's say older than 70. And that has actually occurred in, we are a community that do not really take care of our old people. We put them in homes. So these homes of elderly people tend to be really a very, let's say, sensitive place for the pandemic. And there have been a few outbreaks in the Stockholm area, and that has been mainly in the private healthcare providers for elderly people. So the other trend is that why have we done so much outsourcing to private firms in the healthcare? And the trend is to be, because it seems like the state providers are more careful with these things. And it's the story is that the private firms are cutting the edges and therefore they are not, you know, taking the same precautions with safety materials and so on. So these two trends are what we see. And I would like to hear your comments to that. If you have seen something similar, if you can foresee something similar. That's all. Thank you.
I can comment briefly about the supply chain part. I think the whole world is reconsidering their supply chains, both locally and globally, because during a pandemic like this, we see, you know, how dependent we are on certain things that we don't produce locally, and especially in terms of, you know, giving that first response to a pandemic. These are really crucial, and I feel like it needs to be a dialogue of the both locally and globally to figure out, you know, some of these supply chains and acting timely to do that first response. I think this is one of the areas where the whole world failed. And in terms of the government's response and the healthcare system's response, I fully agree. I think, like Elmira was saying, we do need access to healthcare universally. But then I think the private sector has an important role, because usually the governments are not that flexible. They can't respond as fast as some of the health tech companies can respond. So I still feel that it needs to be a hand-in-hand collaboration to overcome some of these challenges that come with it. And that actually also brings me to something related to this. I think this pandemic we need to see as, sort of like a vaccine. We've had a vaccine and we got a little bit sick, but there will be worse pandemics coming. And, that's one thing the scientists are sure of. So this probably will go down in history as something we have tested, we have survived, maybe, not as well as we could have, but it certainly is a lot of food for thought for the future.
Yeah. Hi, Liana. Liana is a very dear friend of mine, I know exactly where she is in her house in Malmo, because I've been there. Liana, a couple of thoughts. One is, in terms of people, opting to buy local, I definitely think where people can do that, they will. But I think one of the challenges is that these big companies also offer competitive prices. So I think one of the things that need to be addressed is antitrust and competition issues. And so going back to, should we break up Facebook? Should we break up Google? I think that this is one thing that we're going to have a very serious conversation, at least in the United States, about, because a lot of these big companies are located here in the United States. And when you have big companies like Amazon, they just offer competitive prices. And if you've just actually been laid off or you've lost your job, shopping on Amazon where you're going to get the cheapest products possible, that's what you're going to go to. And I think inherently people want to be able to support local businesses, but financially I think it's a really big challenge. So I think in terms of local versus the big brand stores, I think that I don't necessarily think that we're going to see a big switch in that. I think companies like Amazon are going to do very well, not only during this pandemic, but afterwards too. In terms of the elder care and the nursing homes, I don't know what the situation is outside of the United States, so I can't really speak to that. But at least in the United States, I think there's going to have to be a real serious review. And I don't know if that'll happen at the federal level because of the way healthcare is portioned out, and the responsibility is with each state. And I know here in New York City, Governor Cuomo has really emphasized looking at how nursing homes and elder care facilities are being managed. So I think it's going to be a global discussion on how we do that. But I also think it brings in a lot of other factors that aren't just about how do you take care of the elderly. It's also about how do we deal with Social Security and a lot of these other benefits that people require after they retire and get older.
All right, terrific. Thank you. Those were great questions, great answers, and I think where this goes remain to be seen. But I think it's important, at least on the nursing home side too. There's just the idea of an ecosystem, right? And each both the government, the private sector, everyone plays a role, and it's important to get that balance right. So I'm going to turn to the Q&A box now, and if you have a question, please do put it in the Q&A box. And so I'll start here. So we have, how can we recover the economy of the world after the COVID-19 lockdown? So a big question, and perhaps we can take it from, at least the on the entrepreneurial side, or however you want to address it, but it is a giant question, and I hope that there are some good answers out there. So curious to hear yours.
Buke, do you want to take that?
I can, or if you want to go first, you
No,
can.
please, by all means.
So I feel like I'm gonna speak a little bit more sociologically here, but I feel like from what I understand, this pandemic has triggered some of our instincts that maybe have not been triggered, at least in our lifetime, to this extent. So we are our behavioral, the academicians call it immune system, is acting up. So we're trying to minimize the risk of contagion. We're trying to, we are trying to, we want to stay away from people. We want to blame those, who are causing the spread. And then at the same time, our starvation instincts are in place too. We are starting hoarding. We're, we sense that there will be shortages, and these instincts make us more selfish. And I think it is a natural process that comes with this. But I think we do need to find a way of framing this so that we re-trigger our tribal instinct, the instinct of collaborating, and not just nationally but globally, to overcome this. I don't see an easy way out of it economically, otherwise, because I think there's so many resources globally. There's so much effort that is taking place, independent from each other, and we have to find a way to speed up some of the processes we are going through. Otherwise, this will just keep repeating. And the world governments, the G20 countries, have spent so far over 5 trillion in the response, and it's going to go up. They say it's going to go up to 10 trillion. Imagine using these resources for efficiency purposes, for making some of the systems that we're discussing work better globally. So I think I see the solution in collaboration, and both local and global. But Elmira, if you would like to
I don't really
get in from the entrepreneur's perspective too.
I mean, for entrepreneurs, I think really it's going to have to be, in terms of economic recovery, I really do think that here is where entrepreneurs are absolutely indispensable. They need to create the businesses that are going to employ people and be able to do that. And so I think what we need to really focus in on is how do we actually give them the tools to be able to do that. And it's not just the capital, and it's not just whether the workspace or the storefront, it's also about the coping mechanisms, right? Because the situation, I think, is very stressful for all of us, and we're all dealing with a lot of anxiety and a lot of uncertainty. And certainly I think entrepreneurs have a higher threshold for that, but they're still human. And I think in terms of how the world is going to recover, I think entrepreneurs are absolutely going to be a key part of that.
All right. Yes, I think so, and I hope so too. We heard from the UNDP's regional director for Africa Bureau on Monday, and she really saw that as well in Africa, that there's a lot of innovation and creativity that can be unleashed, and that would be a great contributor. So our next question is, says, thank you for this great presentation and dialogue. So yes, thank you, Buke and Elmira. As leaders and conveners, what are the ways that you maintain resilience and community in this challenging time, both for yourselves and for your members?
I go for a lot of walks. But you've been working, Buke, you've been working with the Global Entrepreneurship Network worldwide. How is that network working?
Well, I think as we have been, I think we keep getting to this topic. I think leadership and mentorship is becoming really important at these times. And we see many members of my community are stepping up to take up that leadership role, because like Elmira said, a lot of people are feeling lost and they're losing their courage and enthusiasm. So I think having a path, being part of the solution, and sharing that realistically with your audiences, with your stakeholders, is really important. You know, this is the most important part of crisis management. You do have to acknowledge what's happening. You do have to address it. You do have to figure out a solution, but a solution you can't figure out on your own because there's too many unknowns. But you could potentially figure out if you bring a diverse enough audience together and get opinions from all of those stakeholders to determine a roadmap. And I think with a roadmap, even if it's very short term, I feel that people feel a lot more lost. And I like I just mentioned, the sense of belonging really does become important here. We are rediscovering our families and family relationships, but it's also important in our business relationships, rediscovering those and recreating that sense of belonging.
I think that's a beautiful answer. Thank you, Buke. All right, so turning to the next question is, do you believe the economic relief packages in the United States provide enough resources for entrepreneurs and small businesses?
I think that is an Elmira question.
Yeah, Mira, that one's on you.
In theory, they should be. But I was very disappointed to see how a lot of the big businesses got access to the initial bailout money, and they're the ones that have the accountants and the lawyers that were able to quickly apply through these big banks, which are getting huge amounts of money as well, to facilitate these loans to these businesses. And so I found that smaller businesses have been struggling. I mean, I have a number of friends who are operating small businesses that are otherwise pretty successful, and none of them were able to get access to that first tranche of money. And so, this again speaks to the structural and institutional problem, the systemic problem that we have here in the United States of how the wealthiest have the connections and the access and everyone else gets left out, which is why I think you see a lot of anger within the United States. I think this is going to actually open up a huge discussion within the US government about spending. And when you go back and you look at historical events like the New Deal, which again was created by Franklin Delano Roosevelt at a time to restart the US economy out of a depression, when people had massively lost their jobs and the economy had hit rock bottom, about government programs providing these resources to individuals to be able to then get back on their feet and contribute to the economy again. And this is something that I think the Republican Party has been very resistant to engage in, where they're not willing to talk about a Green New Deal or Medicare for All and a lot of other government initiatives that could, in theory, actually provide a lot of stimulus into the economy. But I think that discussion is going to happen rather than get ignored.
All right. Okay, we're starting to bump up against time. We have a few questions left. So two of them I'm going to try to group and see if we can handle it as a bundle. And then there's one last one that I like that I want to go out on. So two of them are asking sort of about how this crisis can serve as an opportunity or how it's going to shape. So one question asks, how does this crisis actually serve as an opportunity? In what sectors do you see growing? And one of them asks about how this is going to impact education for future entrepreneurs and how how this crisis might shape a new kind of entrepreneur.
Well, I think, as I mentioned before, I think that the sectors that are doing well right now are education, The healthcare sector, obviously technology companies like Zoom and Facebook, I think those are going to be increasingly growth areas. I think those are where the opportunities are, and those are the sectors that are increasingly going to become much more important.
Buke, do you want to add to that at all?
Yes, I'm fully aligned with that. I think, again, there is a lot of unknowns, and I think there will be a lot of new hands-free sectors created out of this. I think one of the questions was about different generations and their needs. I think there will be, I feel like Generation Z having faced this pandemic will probably come out of their protective shells, and they will become more resilient as well. And I think they will probably figure out better means of serving elderly generations better during times like this. So I think there will probably be a sector created around that too.
All right, terrific. And so our last question, if you wouldn't mind, we might just go over a minute or two, is as to female leaders, what do you suggest to female entrepreneurs during these times when multitasking is an ever greater reality? So advice for female entrepreneurs.
So I've actually one of the my future predictions is that female leadership will be on the rise, because we've seen how some of the female leaders around the world are responding to this. And I think it is a matter of, we deal a lot more with this type of multitasking. We have our family responsibilities are very different, and they come to a different level now. But the way that we see the world as a whole, I think will really become a lot more important now. But yes, I think in terms of tactics, tips on how we can deal with this, I think what gives me relief is we're all in the same situation. And I think there is a good example from Rwanda in terms of female leadership. When the genocide occurred, and when 70% of the population were female, they had to step up, and they had to bring females to the positions that were not normally taken up by males. And I think the female population have really performed in these roles and exceeded all the expectations, and they have shown the world that this is possible. And I think one thing that helped this was because I think people understood the challenges they were facing. So the multitasking did not end for them when they were introduced to the labor force, but they allowed this to happen, and they shared. And when that happens, a similar example is Iceland. They managed to overcome to a great extent the wage inequality. And I think if you can give everybody equal responsibilities and recognize that this is a difficult time, and we're all facing these responsibilities together with our work, I think things will change for us, and maybe we'll never have to go back to these conversations again.
Thanks for that, Buke. That's very positive, because I was not feeling too good about the role of women today. I was looking back and having a conversation with a couple of my girlfriends and thinking back how in 2018, 2 years after the US presidential elections, we voted in a record number of women into Congress, both into the House of Representatives and into the Senate. And then looking back at 1992, right after the Anita Hill hearings, again, that was declared the year of the woman. And I was saying how 2020 is the year that women got screwed. And, you know, because we're getting screwed because, as you point out, we're still the default caretakers. And so whether it's taking care of children or elderly parents, doing the housework, the laundry, the making of the food, culturally and traditionally, it still falls on the woman. And what we've actually seen is a drop in. There was a study that I saw about submissions to medical journals and how submissions by women have like dropped at least 50 to 60%. And it's primarily because women are multitasking. So that's the bad news. So we're taking a back seat. Oh, and then the other thing is if you're a woman and you've been on a Zoom call, like talk about the mansplaining and the man interruptions that you get. Like you can't even, if you're a woman, you can't even get a word in edgewise. If there are like 3 men on there, like it's impossible for a woman to get in a word in edgewise. And so I think it's very frustrating for women. But going back to Buke's point, I think that for particularly female leaders and female entrepreneurs, they're actually showing how much more resilient they are. We're seeing, she mentioned New Zealand, obviously in Germany, in Denmark, and a lot of female-led in Taiwan, where female leaders have actually weathered this crisis much better, primarily because they can multitask, but also because they have this ability to listen. And actually be connected to people. And so in terms of advice that I would give to female entrepreneurs is know that this is a really hard period. It's hard, particularly for women, but I do think that, as Buke pointed out with the women in Rwanda, I do see a silver lining where there are going to be increased opportunities for women. And I do think investors are going to start really paying attention to women and really start listening and investing in those companies led by female entrepreneurs.
Terrific. Yeah, I like to take the hopeful note, and I do hope too that some of those opportunities, as people have said, you know, coronavirus and COVID-19 seems to be accelerating all sorts of trends, and one of the trends that I hope it accelerates is a shift in the kind of anachronistic use of time and space in terms of the way education is structured and space is structured. And I think that that's something that entrepreneurs and female entrepreneurs can push forward in a way that makes sense for a scheduling reality and the reality of the multitasking world. So with that, we are past time. Thank you, Buke. Thank you, Elmira. Thank you, everyone who joined. I thought this was a terrific discussion. Brian will be sending around resources. I hope he'll include about the Global Entrepreneurship Network, about Foreign Policy Interrupted, and Elmira's podcast. And if there's any other information, Elmira or Buke, that you would like to add, just send it to Brian and we'll send it to all the participants. We did just add a link to a survey. So we are being entrepreneurial in our adaptation to the internet. So please do fill out the survey if you participated so we can figure out how to do this better. And please do tell friends, because we're in colleagues, because this is the first time that we've opened up our briefing series to people all around the world. And it's wonderful to have people joining from Sweden. We've had people from Vietnam, elsewhere. So please tell others. These calls right now are free and open to all. And I think it's just a great way to have a great, terrific global discussion. We're getting our May schedule up. That should be up. You know, we're starting to book in some more briefings. So check our website, and I hope we see some of you back here soon. So have a great afternoon and evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you.